Hello listeners, and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing energy matters in an informal setting. We return after the Easter break to talk about developments in the global coal market. Many countries in Europe were forced to return to the dirty fuel last year as gas deliveries dried up, and many firms restarted old, mothballed plants. Increased demand for coal saw prices for the fuel soar on the international market, and producers scrambled to supply the surge in coal use. One of the countries that exported large amounts was South Africa, where in recent months there's been a vast increase in so-called ghost trains transporting coal to the port of Richards Bay. Helping me, Richard Sverrisson, to make sense of these trains, set against the background of the wider coal market, is Laurence Walker, gas and coal editor at Montel. A warm welcome to you, Laurie.
Hello, Richard.
So before we go into the nitty-gritty about the so-called ghost trains, let's talk more generally about coal market fundamentals. Now, we're on the path to net zero. The energy transition is underway. There's a massive rollout of renewables, Laurie, but coal is still being burnt. And where is it still being used for power generation in Europe?
In Europe, we're still seeing coal being burnt across Europe. Some of the main consumers remain some of the historically large consumers. So we've got Germany, Poland. There's small amounts being burnt in some of the Western countries, in France, Spain, the UK, Italy. So it's still being burnt, but obviously significantly lower to how it had been in the past. On a global scale, we're seeing obviously significant amounts of coal still being burnt in Asia, in other parts, particularly China, India, Southeast Asia, and some incremental volumes in North Africa as well, although we're talking relatively small volumes for a global point.
The main reason for that is that there's been cheaper compared to gas, then? Would that be a correct assumption?
Yes, I mean, there's a variety of reasons. Certainly what we saw in the last year was that coal became a lot more competitive against gas. And that's why we saw a lot more being burnt in Europe and other parts of the world as well. That's obviously part of the puzzle. There's also the fact that certain countries have had a slower rollout of renewables capacity. They had more significant coal capacity in the first place, which they could rely on and bring back when they needed it. There is also what was most easily brought in, and also the fact that they may have had a shortage of alternatives. So certain countries maybe had a shortfall in nuclear output. They had a reduced hydro availability, so they had to return to something else. And often coal is that baseload fuel that the countries do turn to during this transition.
So, I mean, mainly in Europe, it's probably been a little blip on the sort of path to net zero and amid the energy transition where we've had to keep the lights on. But if you talk us through what's happened to prices in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, Laurie, international coal prices?
Yes, I mean, particularly in Europe, we saw that the price of coal delivered in Europe soaring to close to $500 a tonne earlier last year. These are not sustainable prices. And obviously since then, we've returned right back down to around 120 now. But still, for much of last year, we're looking at prices averaging, in cases, well above $200 a tonne. This was obviously initially sparked by the issues in Russia. So following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were EU sanctions placed on Russia, banning the import of Russian coal to the European Union. This was imposed in early August, but even prior to that, a lot of the utilities had unilaterally or taken it upon themselves to stop buying Russian coal, or at least to cut back on Russian coal. So they started looking elsewhere, and as they began looking elsewhere, prices soared because they were looking to countries where there wasn't so much available supply, or looking to countries that already had buyers elsewhere, in Asia, in other parts of the world. Particularly in Europe, the buyers were finding themselves competing for supplies they wouldn't normally have had. We are looking to South Africa, we're looking to Colombia, looking to the US if possible. Even supplies were coming in of lower grade coal from Indonesia, even from Australia. So these were routes which we haven't seen at all, or we haven't seen very much in the past, only when the opportunity has been there maybe for a day or two. In South Africa, for example, I think I remember speaking with traders days after the invasion of Ukraine, and they were already flying out to South Africa to make deals to secure tonnage. And so, yes, there was a huge surge in prices. It wasn't so much that there was a shortage of coal overall, it was just the reorientating these trade flows. There's also some panic among the buyers. And while these new trade flows and new trade routes settled, people had to pay up for the coal and had to encourage the producers to sell to them. And everywhere, people just started stocking up. And what we have now is an excess of stocks and plenty of supply, more established alternative trade flows to where we had been prior to the war. And as a result, prices are beginning to settle, beginning to go back down again. And I think it would take some significant market shock for us ever to see such prices again that we did see last year.
You mentioned South Africa and the fact that traders were very quick to travel there and try and make some deals with the producers down in South Africa. Could you talk us through what would happen in South Africa last year? I mean, how much did the country export? And was this quite a large percentage rise year on year?
In terms of total volumes, South Africa didn't export much more. I think we're talking around 60 million tonnes they exported last year, which was pretty close to what they exported the year before. The difference came in that the volumes shipped to Europe surged considerably. So I think if we take, for example, we're looking at 7 key European countries, there was something like a 6-fold increase in imports. So we had maybe 2 million tonnes exported to Europe in 2021. Suddenly it became 12 million tonnes last year. South Africa was, for many, a first port of call because we used to buy a lot from South Africa. It used to be one of the main suppliers to Europe. It's used to, and I'd say used to here, I'll probably explain why in a minute, but it used to supply more the kind of coal that we needed in Europe. It was kind of like an old friend. There's something to go back to. People knew some of the suppliers, they knew the people, they knew the market. There was reasonable shipping time compared with some of the alternatives, compared to obviously with going to Australia, for example, or even places in the US. And they could, I think, at times get competitive prices for it. There was, this case of going back to South Africa, re-establishing these routes, which were perhaps there a number of years ago, but had been lost. And the main reason these have been lost in recent years was because of Russia and to some extent Colombia muscling in on the European market and just pumping huge amounts of coal into Europe, which took away South Africa's share. South Africa, in turn, in recent years has just exported more and more to Asia, particularly to India and to Pakistan. So we've become much more reliant on Russia. 60% or so of our coal has been coming from Russia until the war. And we just had to turn back to South Africa.
That's very interesting. I mean, who are the main buyers then and the main users in Europe, Laurence?
I know certain German utilities, probably most of the utilities to some extent who are still burning coal have been taking some South African. One of the main issues, which I was touching on a little bit earlier, is that the quality of South African coal has deteriorated over recent years. That's more a choice decision. It is by choice in South Africa. They've been shipping more to India, to Pakistan, where they need lower grade coal, lower CV coal. That's what they prefer, that's what they want, possibly at a cheaper price. And so probably we've seen something like over the past decade, maybe the share of high calorific coal drop significantly in South Africa, maybe sort of 10 million tonnes or so less than there was a decade ago. As a result, there's limits to how much Europe could buy, and Europe doesn't really want the low CV stuff. It wants a high CV coal. It wants something that's going to replace relatively good Russian coal.
Sorry, just a butt in there, Laurie. For those listeners who may not be aware of CV, that's calorific value, right? So
yes, they tend to want the higher calorific coal, the higher grade coal. Unfortunately, in a way, for South Africa, it was in a very good position. It was in a position where it could have really ramped up exports a lot more to Europe. It could have had the opportunity to cover a lot more of our Russian shortfall than it did. And let's say, 12 million tonnes or so it covered. I think we lost something like 30 million tonnes of Russian coal last year. So there's a reasonable gap that could have been filled. There are other issues as well. So firstly, you can't just suddenly switch you can't just say we're just going to start mining higher grade coal. It takes time to change this. Sometimes maybe they're using different seams, they're using different parts of the mine. And also they also have to, the mine owner, the producer has to consider how long this is going to go on for. Is it worth them switching to improving their grades for, just for a few months or for a year, or how long will this European demand be there? So they were certainly restrained by by the quality, and they've also been restrained by problems within the country. So this is logistical constraints. Their rail capacity is working well below capacity. As a result, the port is exporting at below capacity. Richards Bay to coal terminal, their main export hub, has capacity to export 90 million tonnes so a year, but 60 or so million tonnes exported last year. Most of that would have been through Richards Bay. So the spare capacity is there. The rail, they've had issues with sabotage, with poorly managed routes, with derailments. They seem to have constant challenges, and that unfortunately also has let them down really at this time when they could have really made more of the opportunity.
But then I think when you have the backdrop of these incredibly high prices, I mean, still if we're around $200 a ton, that's still, historically very, very high. You see, the emergence of what we want to talk about today mainly then, Laurie, is these ghost trains in South Africa. Could you say a little bit about what this sort of phenomenon is?
Yes, I suppose it's no secret there's certain levels of corruption. There's problems within South Africa at this time. There's obviously going to be networks involved in this, but yeah, the long and short of it is that there's money which is evading the state-owned firm, going to someone else's pockets, and ultimately, I guess, not going into the country's coffers.
Do we know how much is being transported to Richards Bay via these ghost trains?
So we're looking a lot into this, speaking with various people. We're having to go through various sets of data, information, things that we're hearing. Initially, we were hearing as much as maybe 10% on the rail route was going, which was 5 million tonnes a year or so. We're seeing more information now where it could be considerably more. At times, maybe as much as half the trains going are evading the company, as it were, or going as ghost trains. Certainly, we're still digging here, so there's only a certain amount I'm really comfortable to say at this time, but I think it's fairly safe to say it's probably considerably more than the initial 10% that we thought was running on the line, and a number of possibly large companies is involved as well. So,
I mean, it's obviously a very sensitive topic. It's, there's a huge amount of money to be made, and not least, as you mentioned earlier, the amount of money that's being evaded and not going into the coffers of the South African state. But so, there are people who will only speak to you specifically on strict condition of anonymity. But is this a new phenomenon, these ghost trains? Have you heard of it before, Laurie? Before like the past few weeks?
I personally hadn't heard about this as such in the past, but having spoken with people who are either involved or very close to this now or in recent days, it does appear to be something which has been going on for a number of years. Certainly in South Africa, I'm not sure if elsewhere. They obviously seem to have well-established groups doing this. I think it's just the opportunity again has increased over the past year, and then so as always, that means the volumes are going to increase, the money increases, but it's a lot more widespread now than it was in recent years.
And that's basically because of the high wholesale prices of coal and the high market prices.
It's certainly contributing, yes, I would have thought, and also probably just to some extent the people making the most of, perhaps without a lack of stability within the country, perhaps we could say.
How can the trains then enter the port? I mean, surely that's also, these are supposed to be secured sites where obviously there's quite strict conditions on who they let in and who they let out, in a way.
For Richards Bay Coal Terminal, you'd have to have permission from one of the shareholders of the port, of the terminal. There are obviously a number of large miners who hold shares. There are also a few junior miners, a few small miners.
Obviously, we can't name any of the companies, or we don't really want to, but there's no real evidence of that anyway, as yet. But where's this coal that comes into the bay on these ghost trains? Where is it then exported? Or is it, we don't know. It could go to Europe, could go to Asia, could go wherever people are buying South African coal from.
Yes, yeah. It's just not clear where it's going to end up at this stage. We can only see how generally where all of the coal is going. And as I say, last year, 12 million tonnes to Europe. There's a remainder elsewhere. We can use such a share in terms of those illegally moved as well. It's hard to say, really.
And from a government or Transnet perspective here, Laurie, what can they do to stop this?
I think it's difficult to understand. There's very little evidence as such. Payments are generally made in cash. There's no real paper trail. There's probably people fairly high up the ladder who are involved. There's a lot of covering each other's tracks. I think it would be just obviously a restructuring of the whole system, I think, is really necessary. Quite what they will find or what they will be able to do, we'll see. It'll be interesting to see. But Transnet has said they're investigating it, they're looking into it. All we can really do at this stage is wait to see what they come up with, what they find, how they deal with it. But certainly it does seem rather hard to deal with if it is this endemic already.
Absolutely. And obviously, they'll be doing all they can, and you'll be following these events very closely and reporting it on Montel News, Laurie. But I mean, a final question really is there a sense of obligation on the buyers of South African coal, do you think, to be aware of this? Or Should they be more scrupulous about where they source their coal from?
Certainly, yes. But as we were saying before, it's obviously hard to know which is coming from where, who is involved. Certainly at this stage, I think a buyer is going to have to question a little bit beyond the port, have to look and think, how did the coal get to the port, and what you were importing, and that it's gone through the right channels, that it's being dealt with in the right way. Yeah, beyond that, it's hard to really say quite what you can do to be certain you're not buying coal which has been shipped by a ghost train.
Yeah, it doesn't sort of get stamped, does it? Shipped by ghost train. No, but
no, not really.
No. Well, Laurie, I think this is something we'll follow very closely in the weeks and months to come. So, thank you very much for sharing the status of your investigation into the issue and for being a guest on the Montel Weekly podcast.
Thank you very much.
A short postscript, listeners. We have contacted train operator Transnet for comment on the ghost train problems they flagged up, but they were unable to say anything due to an ongoing investigation into the issue.